Welcome. Tonight's journey, a time when candles flickered softly behind wooden shutters, when footsteps echoed in earthen courtyards, and life moved slowly. This episode explores the quiet, unrelenting rhythm of life in medieval Europe, not in the courts of kings or halls of knights, but in the muddy lanes and smoke-streaked cottages of ordinary people. Peasants. The peasants of medieval Europe lived lives marked not by excitement, but by repetition and adaptation. Not poor in spirit, but constrained by nature, tradition, and necessity. This was not a world of comfort, but it was a world of constancy. Across this journey, each will gently uncover a different part of this overlooked world, from daily life in the village to a quieter, colder sort of hardship. Tonight, there will be no alarms, no abrupt events, only the slow, steady unfolding of days long past, where the fire burns low. And now, let the world of the medieval peasant emerge like mist over the moors. The village never woke abruptly. In medieval Europe, particularly between the 11th and 14th centuries, peasant communities stirred to life gradually, in time with the slow brightening of the eastern sky. There were no alarms, no urgent summons, only the faint light of dawn filtering through wooden shutters or thin cloth coverings, constructed of rough-hewn wood or wattle and daub. Its walls were patched with earth, dung and straw, mixture that, when dried, held firm against the wind. Roofs were thatched with layers of reeds or straw, sloped gently to allow rain to run off. The floor was usually hard-packed. In winter, rushes or hay was spread across it for a little insulation. The sounds that accompanied the day's beginning were as muted and familiar as the rhythm of breath, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of timber. There might be bread. Butter and cheese were rare luxuries. Ale, weak and homebrewed, was safer to drink than water and often consumed in small cups, even in the morning. A peasant home, often referred to as a croft, was simple but sturdy in its own way. Ablutions, if performed, fields spread beyond the edge of the village, often divided into long strips, each belonging to a different family. The sounds of work ceased slowly, the last swing of a hoe, the final call to a child wandering near the hedgerow. Tools were leaned against the wall. These strips rotated crops seasonally under the open field system. One might hold barley, another beans. Supper, if it could be called that, resembled breakfast and lunch. Pottage, bread, perhaps a preserved egg, or a few pickled vegetables. The conversation was soft. Fatigue shaped every gesture. There was little in the way of light. Candles were expensive, rushlights common but smoky, and this system was ancient, and though not efficient by modern standards. A tale told aloud, a hymn, half remembered from Mass, the soft humming of a lullaby, handed down over generations. Dogs barked in the distance, and slowly, as the embers dimmed, full bathing was reserved for rare occasions, typically involving the communal bathhouse, if the village had one. Hair was often hidden beneath linen caps or woolen hoods. Lice and fleas were a common nuisance. The church bell, if the village had one, terse, sexed. None but many villagers did without. Meals were eaten not at fixed times, but when hunger. Midday might bring a break in labor, a return home for a bowl of stew or a piece of bread. Before the fields called again, There were no pillows. Children shared sleeping space with parents, or with one another, often curled together for warmth. Horses were rarely seen outside noble estates. Men and women alike toiled in the fields, joined by older children. Tasks were repetitive and unending. Turning soil, sowing seeds, weeding, reaping, threshing. Each task was dictated not by individual ambition, but by the season's strict calendar. On particularly cold nights, small animals, a lamb or chickens, might be brought inside as well, their presence offering both warmth and security. Inside, space was spare and multifunctional. A single room might serve as bedroom, kitchen, and workroom. There was often no chimney smoke from the central hearth curled upward, escaping through a hole in the roof. The air was thick, with the scent of soot, damp wood. The fire was stirred from its slumber, if it had gone cold overnight. Sparks were coaxed from flint and steel or carried from a neighbor's hearth, if needed. Maintaining flame was a daily priority, not just for warmth or cooking, but for the simple comfort of light. In dark seasons, beds, as such, were rare. Most families slept on straw-stuffed mattresses laid out on wooden platforms or directly on the floor. As the light grew stronger, activity began not with a flurry, but with a sense of resigned necessity. Breakfast usually consisted of pottage left, simmering from the night before grain-based, perhaps thickened with beans or onions, and flavored by whatever herbs or scraps were on hand. There was little privacy in the medieval peasant's life. Outside, the landscape shaped the rhythms of daily labor. Tools were simple, oxen slow. There was no mechanical clock, only the sun's path across the sky. Evening crept in with a kind of softness. Shadows stretched long across the furrows. Inside the home, the fire burned a little brighter, its warmth welcomed as the night grew cooler. Before sleep, there might be small comforts. Tomorrow would begin again. Such was the rhythm of the medieval peasants, and yet, within that repetition, there was structure. Within structure, a kind of peace. The medieval countryside did not run. It ran, quietly and methodically. Peasant labor was not only constanted, each month brought with it a particular set of obligations, repeated generation after generation. This structure, known in some places as the agricultural calendar, divided the year into seasonal labors. These tasks were often memorialized in illuminated manuscripts. The fields were turned over with heavy, creaking plows drawn by oxen. These were not the symmetrical machines of modern farming. The moldboard plow of the Middle Ages was a blunt, cumbersome tool, its iron tip striking against stones and heavy roots. The peasants moved carefully between rows of emerging crops, pulling invasive plants and checking for signs of disease. Children often helped here. Their nimble fingers and smaller size made them ideal for the task. There were no pesticides. A blight could ruin months of labor. Each stalk was precious. Reaping was done by hand, with sickle short, curved blades that required a stooped posture and great care. Every family worked together. Even elders who could not reap might carry bundles or shoo away birds, oxen, but celebration never overshadowed the main concern: storing enough to survive the winter. Firewood was gathered, carts and harnesses were checked, slaughtering if it was to be done. The meat was salted, smoked. Flails, wooden tools connected by a leather thong wire, swung in rhythm to beat the grain heads. Scythes and sickles shaped the summer. Flails, hammers, awls, and spindles were constant companions. Each tool was passed down, sharpened. Women in peasant society worked from dawn to dusk as well. Under the feudal system, most peasants owed labor to the local law. This work could take the form of repairing roads. Their toys, if they had them, were fashioned from discarded bits of wood or bone. Most learned help with planting or shepherding by the age of 7. It was mandatory, and their tools were equally vital. Looms, kneading troughs, butter, churns, and herbal mortar filled homes with quiet utility. Metal was rare, and iron was precious. If a blade broke, it was mended. If not, it was shared. Of preparing, preserving, and praying that the season would be kind. But holy days, tied to the church calendar, offered small pauses. The feast of St. Michael, Candlemas, Easter, and Pentecost. Clothes needed washing, hides needed curing, nets untangled, and if one had no work, it meant only that there was none to be had, something to worry about, not to enjoy. These days brought Mass, but the field was never far from mind, of mending what broke, of enduring what must be endured. In some regions, peasants sowed winter wheat or rye, crops that would lie dormant until spring. The grains were then gathered and winnowed. What fell to the ground could be milled into flour or stored in sacks. Communal labor, shared meals in the fields, harvest songs sung in low harmony. There was solidarity born of shared struggle, a kind of muted companionship that dulled the edges of fatigue. Grass was cut with long-handled scythes, the motion repetitive and soothing in its rhythm. Their hands bore the weight of the entire medieval world. Nettles might be boiled to soften the fibers. Tools were carved or repaired. Even when fields were frozen, bundles were dried in the sun. They trudged patiently, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. The pages of those books were adorned with gold leaf and painted with care, but the lives they depicted were far from gilded. Behind them, birds hovered nearby. Scarecrows were common, though rarely effective. In early spring, often beginning in March, the ground began to thaw. Sowing came next. Barley, oats, rye were cast by hand, scattered in sweeping motions by the farmers who walked the rows. By April and May, attention shifted to weeding and maintenance. Summer months brought the hay. By late August and into September, the rhythm quickened. It was harvest time, the most intense period of the peasant's year. Fields of barley. Harvest festivals were common, though rarely lavish. A small surplus might allow for a bit of ale, perhaps a dance, or the sharing of a sweetbread. After harvest came threshing, the process of separating grain from chaff. Then came the ploughing of winter crops. Fields did not rest long. October and November were months of repair and preparation. Fences were mended. By December, the land lay mostly still, but the peasants' work continued. Winter was the time for spinning wool, weaving cloth, mending garments. Tools, though basic, were crucial. The plough, perhaps the most important, was a communal asset. The use of tools wasn't limited to men. Tasks were not isolated to one's own holding. The physical toll was immense. Calloused hands. Children too. Yet, amidst the toil, there were moments of cooperation. The year, for the peasant, was not a story of great events. It was a cycle of work and waiting. There were no holidays in the modern sense. Even leisure bore signs of labor. Thus passed the medieval year. One task folded into the next, like furrows in a field. Tools, calluses, and prayers were the cornerstones of survival. And so, while the nobility wrote letters and designed crests, the peasants turned the earth, trusting in seeds and seasons. Now, let the rhythm of their days drift behind like a fading echo, as we turn toward the deeper structures that shaped their reality, not tasks or tools but bonds. Peasants did not live in isolation. Their cottages and even their labor were intricately tied into a social order that had as much weight as stone walls or winter snow. This was the feudal Weber hierarchy, made not only of ranks and titles, but of duties, customs, and unwritten expectations passed from one generation to the next, and often a church hall overseen by a lord, or occasionally a monastery or bishop. The lord might be a nobleman. His manor was part of a broader network of lands. At the heart of this system lay the manor. A manor was not just a building. It was an Astata cluster of villages. The people who lived on this land, in the eyes of the law, they were not slaves, but neither were they entirely free. Their obligations were defined not by contract, but by custom. Some were freemen, meaning they held their land in return for rent or labor, but could leave the manor if they wished. Freemen were rare. He maintained order, often through a manorial court. He might grant permission to collect firewood. There were no folders of paperwork. Instead, reputations served as archives, and verbal testimony had the weight of proof. If a man was known to have used a certain plot for years, that knowledge carried legal force. The priest's presence was not only spiritual but economic. He might own animals, employ laborers. Superstition intertwined with belief. Prayers to prevent illness, charms to ward off bad weather. The church was the spiritual center of the village, and its bell called the people not only to worship. If a rite had been exercised for generations, such as gathering firewood or grazing, these customs were unwritten laws. Most, however, found a balance between submission and survival, negotiating, compromising, and adapting as needed. He collected tithes, often 1/10 of the village's annual produce. These tithes, it gave structure to their toil, rules to their disputes, and meaning to their sacrifices. Most, however, were serfs, also known as villains or bondmen. These were peasants legally bound to the land. They could not leave without permission, but it was theirs to endure. The court settled local matters, land disputes, unpaid debts, violations of custom. The process was slow, oral, and deeply rooted in local tradition. Peasants themselves often sat on juries, listened to testimonies, and passed judgment under the eye of the Lord's steward, a world of superstition, sound, and shadow. This typically meant working the Lord's domain, the land, kept for his own. Tasks could include harvesting, repairing roads, maintaining fences, or tending the lord's livestock. The village field system divided the land into long, narrow strips. This fragmentation discouraged consolidation and made cooperation necessary. No peasant could plant or harvest alone. They had to coordinate with neighbors to avoid trampling one another's crops. To maintain ditches, these services were performed in addition to the work on their own plots, and custom could be as firm as iron. There were also rents and dues paid, in kind, labor, or coin. A serf might owe a portion of his grain harvest, a set number of eggs, a few chickens, or a fee upon the marriage of his daughter. Even death did not exempt the peasant from obligation. If a serf, his heirs might be required to pay a heriot, a fee to reclaim the family's right to the land, and yet the manor was not a prison in the way we might imagine. The obligations went both ways. The lord was expected to protect his peasants in times of war or famine. The manorial court was an important institution. It met regularly monthly. It was here that records were kept in a peculiar form, by memory and by repetition. Peasant families typically held strips of land, not continuous plots. There was also the glebe, land reserved for the local priest, who held it on behalf of the church. Still, religion shaped. The church calendar dictated feast days. Saints' days marked turning points in the year. Despite the hardships of the feudal web, peasants found ways to assert themselves. Custom was their shield. Others were pragmatic. Tensions could simmer. Rebellions were rare, but not unheard of. In time, the feudal web began to fray. The Black Death, rising commerce, and the eventual monetization of rent changed the dynamic. Peasants gained more leverage. In the centuries of the High and Late Middle Ages, the manor remained the center of the peasant world, both a burden. There were no illusions, and that endurance quiet. Let us now descend more deeply into the quietest moments of medieval peasant life, those hidden from court records and ignored by scribes. Not every hour of a medieval peasant's day was spent beneath the sun or in the fields. There were quieter moments too. Soft hours passed within the walls of modest homes, marked not by the clang of metal or the rustle of wheat, but by simpler sounds: the hiss of water on stone, the creak of old wood, the low hum of human voices after dark. Inside the croft, the hearth was more than a source of warmth. It was the center of life. The fire flickering on its heat, the day's food was cooked, a spoon scraping the inside of a clay bowl, a kettle rattling gently atop a stone, wool brushing against wood as a woman twisted thread with a spindle, a child breathing heavily in sleep. Speech was spare. There were few secrets in a one-room home, but candles were not burned without reason. Each wick represented labor, animal fat rendered, wicks twisted, molds cast, or tallowed by hand. In many homes, families spoke when they needed to, and silence, particularly in the evening hours, was not discomforting. A few stools or benches, worn smooth by years of use, were scattered about. A late traveler might pass the road, cartwheels crunching the soil. Dogs barked, sometimes in alarm, sometimes at nothing. The cold made sound. The smallest creak of a board beneath a foot could feel profound. Sleep arrived not on schedule, but as a gentle and accepted surrender. There were no beds, as we know them, just straw pallets, woolen blankets. Storage came in the form of chests or baskets, tucked away in corners. Clothing and tools were hung on pegs, driven into the walls in the bitter months, wrapped in every available layer, their breath fogging the air in the early morning cold. In the long nights of winter, stories might be told, folktales, saints, legends, or old village gossip polished into fable. The voice of an elder carried weight. Even the youngest listened, not because they were told to, but because there was little else to occupy their ears. The roof beams were blackened by years of smoke. It was the silence of exhaustion. The peasant home did not abound in furniture. Singing came naturally, a harvest chant, a melody half remembered from youth. Lullabies echoed across generations. A simple trestle table might serve for eating, mending, and preparation. Illumination came from firelight, the occasional rushlight, or in wealthier homes, a tallow candle. In this dimness, time slowed. These connections were not recorded or formalized, but they were no less binding than feudal ties. A peasant might depend more on his neighbor than his lord, and disputes, while inevitable, were often softened by necessity. Some households, others simply sat in quiet. The sounds outside the home shifted with the seasons. In summer, allowing the chirp of crickets or the distant croak of frogs to drift in. In winter, the silence was nearly total. Snow muffled everything, the pop of sap in the wood, the muffled cough of someone still awake. The peasant's sense of time was shaped less by hours. Children curled together. Parents kept close, but there was comfort too. The nearness of kin, the predictable rhythms of shared labor, the deep, unspoken knowledge that tomorrow would bring the same tasks, the same obstacles, and if the world, among neighbors, relationships were cautious but vital. A borrowed pot, music when it appeared, a crude. The peasant's world was tactile. Rough wool against the skin, the bite of wind through an open doorway, the lingering aroma of leeks in stew, the feel of bread slightly burned at the edge, the soft pressure of another body beside you as the night deepens. These were not the things that made it into chronicles or royal records. These were the rhythms behind the rhythms, the breaths between the lines of history, even hardship. As the fire settled into glowing coals, and the last bowl was scraped clean, a kind of pause set in a moment, before sleep, before dreams, before another cycle began. It is in this silence that the truth of medieval peasant life is most clearly felt, not in the tools or the toil, but in the hush of a world sustained not by comfort or wealth, but by day after day. The story of the peasant is not one of heroism or triumph. It is one of continuity. With the embers cooling and the sounds fading, we leave the peasant's hearth behind. In the next chapter, we will shift our gaze to a single life one, but by the cold weight of bondage and law, the inheritance of servitude To be born into bondage in medieval Europe was not a dramatic moment. There were no proclamations, no visible shackles, just a child's maw, wrinkled, wailing wrapped in worn linen and handed into a life already defined by obligation. The serf was not property in the strictest sense. The law, the custom, and the land all conspired to place him within a structure from which few ever escaped. This is not the story of a single individual, but a composite life, drawn from records, a life common to thousands across the continent, whether in the rolling fields of France, the wooded hills of England, or the river valleys of the German principalities. Born in the final decade of the 13th century, in a village nestled beneath the shadow of a modest manor house, the child entered a world of certainty. The house into which he was born was like others. One room, a patch of land, a few animals, and walls blackened by generations of cooking smoke. His parents were villain serfs, tied to the land whose obligations were listed on a scroll stored in the manor stewardess chest. These scrolls, written in Latin, often detailed not only rents and services, but family names, dowries, and deaths. Lives recorded in ink. By custom, the child inherited his parents' status. Freedom was not earned, it was either bought. He would remain on this land unless fate, or the will of the Lord, dictated otherwise. Perhaps half of children born into peasant households did not survive beyond the age of 5. The reasons were many, but none were new. Spoiled milk, fever, injury, poor nutrition. If he survived, it was not through strength, but through fortune. In his early years, the burdens of servitude were distant. The family's survival depended on these narrow patches scattered across the lord's estate. Cooperation with neighbors was not optional. The shared use of oxen, tools, and ploughing schedules required trust, or at least habitual tolerance. Infancy, toys were improvised. The manor court assigned tasks seasonally, repairing a bridge, cleaning a ditch, helping harvest the lord's barley. These were not requests. Failing to appear brought fines, which could be exacted in coin, grain, or labor. Disputes were aired. Attendance was mandatory. One could be fined for brewing ale without a license, for grazing pigs in the wrong wood, or for failing to repair a fence. The boy's name was likely listed in the court rolls. Education, as we know it, was unknown. The priest, but the boy's literacy would remain in the body. The way to swing a flail, the rhythm of ploughing, the careful steps of sowing seed. By the age of 7, his childhood had already narrowed. Tasks came early: fetching water, a fine called a merchet. Marriage was not just union, but administrative adjustment. A new household meant a new entry in the court records, a new set of obligations, a new source of labor on his family's plot. Sundays for church. His sense of the outside world came through visiting traders, the priests, sermons, or rare gossip from passing pilgrims. The wars of kings felt distant. The winds of politics barely stirred the hedgerows near his fields. As a villain, his family held strips of land in the open field system. These were not owned, but tenure granted in return for labor and dues. Adolescence. At 15, the court itself was a small but significant institution, held in the Lord's Hall or under a large tree. It was presided over by the Reaver senior peasant, the bailiff. By early adulthood, perhaps around 20, he had entered into a binding rhythm. 3 days of labor on the Lord's land each week. Feast days punctuated the months. Marriage, too, was not entirely personal. Serfs required the Lord's permission to wed, particularly if the bride or groom came from a neighboring manor. Life settled into this pattern. Seasons governed tasks, and custom governed behavior. The Lord's estate might dictate how much wood could be gathered, when and where pigs might forage, and which paths were safe to tread. And yet, in many ways, this young man's experience was normal. The walls of his world were not bars, but habits. His life was shaped not by resistance, but by acceptance. He might have never traveled more than 10 miles from his home. He knew more of the soil than of saints, more of the ox's pace than the rhythms of courtly poetry, and yet his hands built a world. His labor filled the Lord's granary, paved the road for the passing knight, supported the bishop's tithe. He was quietly the spine of his society. But the weight of that role would grow heavier with time. He would come to understand the constraints, more deeply not, but in the inherited debts, inherited expectations, and limited avenues of change. We will follow him further into middle age, when his labor intensifies and options narrow. But for now, let the candles burn low in the peasant's dwelling. Let the distant sound of livestock, settling for the night, echo beyond the hedgerow. We leave him here resting in a world that offers little rest. In time, the shape of the serf's life settled into middle age, if it could be called that, often began before the body had reached its prime. A man of 35, stooped from years in the field, lined with sun and marked by the repetitive pull of the plough, might already be considered old among his peers. His hands were worn from tools that splintered and rusted. His knees knew the grind of uneven soil. His back remembered each season in layers of quiet ache. And still, the work continued. 3 days each week, and often more, were dedicated not to one's own survival, but to the service of another. The Lord's domain, the land, held directly by the manorial estate required constant care. In the warm months, there were crops to tend, weeds to pull, stones to clear, ditches to dig. He knew the season's duties as well as the sunrise. He did not ask if the work was fair, nor did he question the balance of the arrangement. He might complain to his wife, or grumble under his breath, but open resistance was rare and dangerous. In winter, when the ground was hard, there were fences to repair, wood to cut, livestock to shelter, and tools to mend. A bonded serf worked. He knew where he belonged on the long list. Still, it was not unknown. A woman who gathered firewood. These were infractions, sometimes punished with fines, sometimes forgiven, sometimes remembered for years. Others offered coin in place of labor, what historians call commutation. These acts were not always welcomed by the lords, but as the economy changed, coin became valuable. After long hours on the domain, he returned to till his own soil, sowing barley, beans, or oats, rotating crops, as the open field system required. He counted on the weather, but did not trust it. A late frost, a heavy rain, a swarm of insects each could undo a season's work. In some regions, cash payments slowly replaced personal labor. There were no banners, no clashes. There were ways more deliberate, nearly invisible by which peasants pushed back. The family might sell a pig, or a cloak, or even borrow against the next year's yield, adding a quiet layer of debt to their already heavy load. A sickle left in the grass a little longer than needed. A day claimed for illness, real or feigned. A favor owed repaid slowly. Tasks completed. Stones left where they lay. But such generosity had limits. The margin between survival and hunger was narrow, and each family knew it. This was not rebellion in the romantic sense, but it was resistance, quiet and constant, woven into the very way a man moved. And yet, there were moments when resistance became bolder. The manorial courts, though small, recorded cases of defiance. A son who left the village without permission. Collective resistance did occur. One had married and moved to the next village. Another had died in infancy, marked with a wooden cross that leaned as the seasons passed. A third worked beside him. In the late 13th and early 14th centuries, some villagers negotiated their obligations, but for most, the bargain remained unchanged. The serf's own land, the strips allocated to his family, offered little rest. When the harvest was poor, the burden did not ease. Rents were still due, dues still demanded. The manor required grain, livestock, and labor, whether the yield was plenty or scarce. In these times, bread was stretched with husks, ale was watered down, children received less than they needed, but they stirred thought. In wealthier villages, still, despite the weight, life had moments of stillness. A clear morning in late spring, the sound of wind through uncut grain, and yet the horizon once only fields, and clouds seemed to shimmer ever so slightly with possibility. The first soft plum blossoms near the edge of the fields, the slow smile of a child whose task had, at last, become skill. The passing years brought changes, some visible, others hidden. The man's name remained in the court rolls, but now with a string of additions, and the legacy of a life measured not in wealth or freedom, but in quiet, enduring labor, grew barley on the North Strip, failed to appear for the September reaping, paid merchat for daughter's marriage to Thomas of Alderwood, fined one hen for gathering branches in the forbidden wood, each line a thin record of a thick life. His children had grown. There was no expectation that life would change. The manor remained. The steward's scrolls thickened. The seasons spun forward. But slowly, imperceptibly, the world around the manor began to shift. Towns, once distant, travellers passed more frequently. Merchants traded cloth for grain. Pilgrims spoke of relics and far places. Whispers of freedom passed through the hedgerows. A cousin who'd left for the town, a neighbour who vanished without paying his fines. These were outliers. The serf, now older, bore the same name, the same obligations, his hair greyed, his place in the manor unchanged. Staying was safer, and so his days continued. Animals fed, duties performed, not with joy, not with hatred, but with a long, slow perseverance. Soon his story would move toward its close, not in sudden collapse, but in the slow dimming of strength and certainty. He had lived in a cage without bars, shaped not by cruelty, but by expectation, and now we prepare to follow him into that final chapter, his last obligations. There comes a time when even the rhythm of toil begins to loosen its grip, not from relief, but from wear. From the long memory of seasons too many, to count etched into the hands like grooves in old wood, the serf, now aged, perhaps in his 50s, carries with him not only the years, but the weight of what those years have earned: a small plot, still held, a few surviving children, a wooden spoon, smoothed by time. To grow old as a peasant in medieval Europe was neither expected, it was a quiet achievement. The body slowed. Eyes no longer saw the subtle changes in a field of grain. Tasks once done with ease now required rest. A bundle of firewood felt heavier. A walk to the village well took longer. And still the duties remained, though perhaps now pass more often to sons or neighbors. Among many communities, a sense of respect existed for elders, not ceremonial, but practical. The wisdom of age did not translate to escape, but it was useful. Memory was a kind of currency. Knowing the best place to plant cabbages, or how to read a cloud bank before a frost, was valued. An old man who had seen 40 harvests, whose hands had shaped half the village hedgerows, he might be excused from one of the Lord's labours. The steward might allow his dues to be fulfilled by a younger relative. There was no pension. Still, the final years of a serf's life were not idle. A rosary of knotted twine, each bead rubbed smooth by prayer and time. Not always ominous, he might come to share bread or offer a prayer, but his presence signaled the turn, a final mass, a whispered confession. They were filled with small tasks: mending nets, shelling beans, sharpening tools, telling stories. There were preparations, to some spoken, others quietly assumed. It had swept through in fevers. It came silently, often in sleep. If the man had owned a single ox, it was not viewed with outrage. It was the law of the land. The corpse was wrapped in a shroud, often nothing more than a simple linen sheet, and a grave was dug by neighbours, marked with a wooden cross, or, in many cases, nothing at all. If no animal remained, occasionally the Lord waived it, especially if the man had served loyally, or if his family was too poor to bear the loss. Possessions, though few, had meaning. A carved comb passed from mother to daughter, a worn cloak stitched with unfamiliar thread, and then, at some point I could never say quite when, the man's name stopped appearing on the manorial rolls for new duties. He was marked, instead, in a different sick. There was no need for poetry or eulogy, only the acknowledgement of what had always been inevitable. It was a familiar visitor. It had come for siblings in childhood. When it arrived for the serf, it was marked by the final dues. The Haratan ancient custom required that the lord be paid a death tax. Usually, this meant the deceased's best animal. The body was prepared with quiet dignity. There were no elaborate funeral rites, no tombs or statues. A handful of soil was tossed upon the chest. A candle might be lit. He had raised children, paid fines, bowed his head when required, and on occasions lifted it when he shouldn't have. Then the village returned to its work. Serf's passing was recorded in the court roll by the steward, who wrote carefully in Latin, "Mortius est." He has died. His name followed by the date. Sometimes a note left, one ox. Widow survives, son in a life summed up in a line of ink. In the home he left behind, there remain traces, the tools he had sharpened, the field he had furrowed, year after year. The stories still told in winter, about the time he once caught a runaway pig, or helped rebuild the mill after a storm. Among the community, someone else now turned his soil. His name, once spoken daily, became part of a sentence that began, "Remember when?" and then less frequently still. Yet his life, in its constancy, it had mattered not because he had conquered or invented. He had lived within a system that did not reward ambition, that did not offer escape, that did not remember names for long. But he had risen with the sun, he had planted and harvested, and when he passed, this, then, was the final duty. But the quiet completion of a life shaped entirely, and so, with the last toll of the church bell echoing over the fields, yet in doing so, we begin to see the countless lives, lakizu, unpreserved, but essential to the world they supported. How history forgets the peasant. There were no chroniclers at the edge of the village, no scribes capturing the details of his last days, or poets composing verse 2. The records such as they were resided in ledgers and court rolls, scribbled in a steward's practiced hand. And yet, these documents were concerned not with personality, not with story, but with obligation, in death as in life. The peasant was remembered only for what he owed. Then, the tools he had used were passed along or rusted quietly in the corner of a shed. The name, once spoken daily, became infrequent, then rare, and finally faded into the hum of background memory. A Harriet, a brief mention that a son, and still the world moved forward. The seasons advanced. The soil was tilled by new hands. This was not neglect. It was not malice. It was simply the reality of a world without written memory for the many. Medieval Europe preserved the stories of kings, of saints, of battles and miracles. It recorded treaties, but for the serf whose life had fed the kingdom, paved its roads, and filled its granaries there, was little space in the scrolls. It is only in fragments that his story survives, in the polyptychs of Carolingian manners, in the English Domesday Book of 1086, where some are listed by name as shadows beneath the greater lands, in the margin notes of abbey records, where fines for missing a service or stealing timber were quietly noted. The village was rarely written, a way of speaking that shaped thoughts, joys, insults, and prayers, and yet left behind almost nothing. But these are fragments. Even the languages in which peasants lived were often denied permanence. While Latin and French filled the documents, the everyday tongued, earthy dialects of the field, the hearth historians have reconstructed these lives through laborious work, through the traces left in soil patterns, through wills where a father leaves my best cloak to my son, through skeletons exhumed from fields, beside chapels marked by worn joints, broken teeth, and signs of relentless labor. What emerges is not a single man, a life shaped by limits, repeated by millions, and remembered only by inference. And yet, even this obscurity holds a certain meaning. The serf's life may not have inspired books or statues, but it sustained the world that did. It was his labor that maintained the manor, his sons who were levied to war, his daughters who nursed future generations. That endurance is its own kind of legacy. His absence from history is not erasure, it is a kind of quiet presence. For even now, centuries later, we walk roads, we live in towns whose names bear the memory of villagers, we eat foods descended from his crops, speak words shaped by his dialects, and dream dreams in homes that sit upon land once worked by hands like his. The medieval peasant may have vanished from the page, but he remains in the structure of the world. He remains in the idea that constancy can have meaning, that to live a small, hard life with dignity and resilience is a history worth knowing. And so, the biography of the bonded serf ends not in tragedy, nor in triumph, but in continuity and name lost. A life we now leave him behind, not forgotten, but acknowledged, a whisper carried forward not in ink. What the earth remembers. History often favors the loud, the written, the monumental, yet in the quiet soil of Europe's countryside, not of conquests or decrees, but of bowls buried in hearths. These traces the objects of everyday life form, the faint outlines of a peasant world, otherwise lost to time, and it is through archaeology. Much of what is known about medieval peasants has been reconstructed not from documents, but from the very earth they lived upon, in villages or quietly emptied during enclosures. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of life, foundations made from stone and timber, pits once used to store grain, charred remains of hearths where hundreds of meals were once prepared, and within these modest ruins, often overlooked, that reveal something deeply intimate. The habits, beliefs, and quiet rituals of people whose names are long gone. Consider, for example, the placement of objects within a home. In several sites across England and northern France, archaeologists have discovered ceramic bowls intentionally buried. These were not dropped accidentally. They were placed deliberate. Such deposits are believed to be protective in nature, a kind of folk charm to ward off illness, bad spirits, or misfortune. Beneath the same floors, animal bones. The purpose remains uncertain, but scholars suggest these may have been foundational offerings tied to fertility, good luck. The peasants may have been Christian in name and practice, but these practices hint at a parallel world of belief, passed not through scripture, but through custom and whispered inheritance. Children's toys offer another window into this world. These were not possessions of the wealthy, but of children in small cottages, left behind as the years passed. In several medieval layers, simple carved figures have been uncovered: horses with wheels, tiny wooden people, dolls made of rags and straw. Though they bear no names, they carry traces of affection. A horse smoothed by a child's hand, a doll repaired with bits of string. These were used to mill grain by hand. These objects, too humble for chronicles, are now preserved in museum drawers, carefully catalogued but rarely displayed. In the corners of excavated homes, grindstones are frequently found, sometimes set into the very floor, but their placement near hearths, beside windows suggests but part of the daily rhythm of life, integrated into family space. Nearby, pieces of broken pottery, some coarse, used for cooking, others glazed, suggesting a small moment of ornament, hint at a world where utility and beauty coexisted, even in the simplest forms. In deeper layers, even human remains have been found buried close to dwellings, particularly infants. A corner of the yard. These burials, while not common, when formal burial in the churchyard was not possible, or when the family chose something closer, a patch of ground. Again, the purpose is partly guesswork, but the care with which these remains were laid to rest suggests something profound. Love, expressed within the limits of custom and hardship. Beyond the homes themselves, the fields also speak. In the soil, long furrows remain evidence of the open field system. Even centuries later, their ghosted outlines show where peasants once ploughed, year after year, creating ridge and furrow patterns visible from the air. But they remain silent monuments to effort and repetition. No text records who dug them. Other features, too, have emerged. Holloways, deep sunken tracks between fields, worn by thousands of footfalls and cartwheels. Moats, not grand defensive structures, but simple ditches to control water. Waste pits filled with broken tools, simple leather shoes, stitched by hand, worn through at the heel, patched with care, so modest, and yet shaped perfectly to the form of a foot that once walked the same ground we now study. Archaeology reveals not just objects, but habits, where people sat, how they cooked, what they left behind, in the absence of names and stories. And though it speaks softly, it speaks clearly. It tells us that peasants, though often dismissed by their contemporaries, lived lives of intention and imagination. They believed in more than what was preached. They decorated what they could. They protected what they loved. And in their own quiet way, these remnants, these faint echoes beneath the floorboards, are all that remain. But they are enough. They remind us that history is not only about kings and wars. It is also about bowls buried beneath thresholds, and dolls left in the dust. The blended beliefs of the village mind. The church steeple rose above the thatched roofs, like a shepherd's staff watching over its flock. Its bell tolled out across the fields each morning and evening. And yet, the spiritual world of the medieval peasant, it drifted outward. It whispered through charms and murmured through folk remedies. And so, a world emerged that was neither fully Christian nor wholly pagan, but something deeply interwoven, rooted in place, and shaped by centuries of need. For the medieval villager, faith was not an abstract system of theology. It was a practical matter, a shield against misfortune, a comfort. They believed in Saintsbert. They attended Masbert. They prayed the Pater Nosterand, whispered older words, passed down not through scripture, but through grandmothers. This was not contradiction, it was survival. In the village, the parish priest was often the only literate man. He led the weekly mass. He reminded the people of feast days, urged them to confess, and collected tithes, a tenth of grain, eggs, or coins on behalf of the church. And yet, even the priest understood that beneath these rituals lay a deeper, more local rhythm. The fields themselves had their patron saint, Saint Isidore in Spain, Saint Cuthbert in northern England. Their images might be carved into wooden beams, offering bits of grain. Saints were not distant icons. They were neighbors spoken of as if they might pass through the gates, but alongside them moved older figures. The willow, the wisp, a drifting light seen across marshes, the forest crone, whose gaze could curdle milk or dry a calf's tongue. These beings had no feast days, but their presence. The rhythms of the year were guided by the liturgical calendar, with its long periods of fasting and feasting. Lent brought abstention o' meat. Easter marked renewal, both spiritual and agricultural. Michaelmas, in September, signaled the end of harvest. Martimas in November marked the slaughtering of livestock before winter, but the older agricultural rhythms lingered beneath. Beltane in May, though not officially observed, left its traces in bonfires and garlands. The winter solstice, though repackaged as Christmas, still carried the weight of darkness and rebirth. Peasants blessed their fields with holy water. They crossed themselves before milking a cow. They drew small protective signs, crosses, yarrow for wounds, and a pinch of elderflower. Always carefully handled its tree, believed to house ancient spirit. Their knowledge was vital, but feared. A woman who could ease childbirth or still a fever was respected, but not too much. A sudden death, a crop failure, a malformed lamb hand. Suspicion might bloom like mold in the mind. Accusations of witchcraft were rare in early medieval communities, but not unknown. They often came not from malice, but from fear, from a need to explain the inexplicable in a world where famine, plague, and storm arrived without warning or logic. And so the village mind carried two kinds of belief, one taught from the pulpit, the other murmured over bread dough or whispered to a child at bedtime. The sacred and the superstitious lived side by side. Dreams were considered messages. Sneezing might be an omen. The movement of the stars, the call of an owl, the way a candle flickered, these things held meaning, however faint. In some households, a small charm pouch might be tied above, a cradle filled with salt, iron. In others, a silver coin might be hidden beneath the hearthstone, meant to attract prosperity or ward off illness. Even illness itself was seen as part spirit, part sin, part imbalance. A child wasting away might be said to have been overlooked by the priest or cursed by a jealous glance. These were not foolish beliefs. They were the framework of protection in a world without modern medicine, without certainty, and often without mercy. And so the peasant's day passed guided by prayers and gestures, herbs and signs, warnings and blessings. At dusk, and in some homes a quiet phrase was spoken not from the Bible, but older still. Let no shadow pass the threshold this night. In the morning, life would resume. The fields would need tending, the animals, but the mind carried with it the outlines of this inner world become visible once again. And as archaeologists unearth bowls beneath thresholds, as historians translate manorial finds for improper charms, and as folktales are recovered from later collections, a world not of strict faith or wild magic but vanishing places and the silence they leave behind, somewhere across the rolling hills of the countryside, whether in the Midlands of England, the low valleys of Germany, covered in grass, perhaps a few scattered stones beneath the soil, a hollow way tracing an old path, a cluster of fruit trees growing in what once was someone's garden, and beneath that soil a story waits. These are the deserted medieval villages, lost settlements, once full of life and labor, now fallen into silence. Their names survive in maps, in deeds, in oral memory. But the people are gone, not suddenly, not in one great collapse, but slowly, like the fading of smoke from a dying fire. Deserted villages are not ruins. In the dramatic sense, they are not crumbled castles or broken abbeys. They are quieter than that, but they tell us something profound about the lives of the peasants who once lived there, and about the fragility of the systems that supported them. Across England alone, more than 3,000 villages are known to have been abandoned between the 11th and 16th centuries. Each left its own soft impression on the land. A raised platform where a cottage once stood, shallow ditches that outlined a garden, the faint outlines of Rajan-furrow fields, and, almost always, the stone foundations of a church, still visible when the grass grows low. Why did they vanish? Sometimes it was plague, the Black Death, beginning in 1348. In many places, it took 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. For small villages, there were no grave diggers, no one to bring in the harvest. The survivors sometimes left, joining relatives in nearby towns, seeking shelter within the walls of monasteries, or becoming tenants in better-off manors that needed laborers, emptied. Other times, as sheep farming became more profitable in the 15th century, landowners began enclosing common fields, fencing them, turning them into pasture. A whole community might be displaced, not by illness or fire, but by wall. This enclosure was gradual. There were no soldiers, no torches, fences where paths used to be, and silence. Sometimes it was environmental. A river changed course. The soil turned to sand. A village built on hope could vanish under the slow, grinding pressure of unsuitable ground. In some cases, war played its part. The 100 Years' War in France, raids along the Scottish border, local feuds between rival lords, but often these were symptoms. The real force behind village abandonment was slow erosion of population, of opportunity, of resilience. Archaeologists study these places carefully. They map out the shapes of vanished homes. They sift through midden heaps, ancient trash pits to find buttons, bones, broken combs. They use aerial photography to detect the faint lines left in soil by long-gone walls. And they walk slowly over the ground, looking not for treasure, But for texture, in one village, a bronze spindle whorl might be found, once used to spin thread beside the fire. In another, a bone ice skate. In yet another, the remains of a communal bread oven, and each is irreplaceable. Some of these deserted places still bear names often ending in tun, by, or ham. Others survive only in fragments. A line on a medieval map, a half-remembered field name. Locals sometimes tell stories about them, that there's a curse, that the land is hollow, that people used to live there long ago. Sheep now graze, birdsong echoes where once there were hammers, voices, and bells. Time passes, but beneath the stillness lies history. It's filled with memory muted. They were not powerful, but they were real. Their disappearance, how weather, disease, economy, and chance combine, and how a world, once so full, can slowly vanish, almost unnoticed. And yet, by walking the paths that remain, we allow these places to speak again, not loudly, but clearly. And for a moment, we hear the voices of those who once stood where we now stand. Not kings, not saints, just people, gone, but not forgotten. To walk through a museum's medieval collection is to pass through a quiet world of fragments. There is no grandeur, no golden crowns or jeweled chalices. Instead, there are things that once lived in cupboards, pockets, and hearth corners. A buckle bent with age, a shard of pottery bearing a single fingerprint, a rusted spindle whorl, a spoon worn to a pail, a shoe sole molded to the shape of its owner's foot. And yet, from these pieces often, no larger than a coiner world can be rebuilt. The life of a medieval peasant left few written traces. Tells us not only about cooking but about the communal nature of food. But through archaeological finds, we see what ink could not preserve. The shape of a life, made of repetition. The break in the handle might have been patched with wire, used for years before the final fracture. It was likely one of the most valuable items in that home. A broken cauldron handle, found near the hearth of a deserted cottage. Cauldrons were rarely owned by just one family. They were expensive, forged of bronze or iron, handed down, shared. Near it, a bone needle, small and curved, its eye worn soft from use. This, too, was not disposable. It may have stitched the same cloak again and again. Perhaps a child's tunic, perhaps burial shrouds. Its value was not in what it was made of, but in what it enabled. The repair of warmth in a cold world. Elsewhere, archaeologists uncover beads made of glass, simple adornment, no lavish jewelry, a sign that even in poverty, beauty had its place. In refuse pit cellars of discarded material built over years, tortured a material built over years, to end broken, a deer antler. From these, we learn the patterns of diet, which animals were eaten, which were kept, and which were never touched. A humerus cracked to extract marrow, a pile of oyster shells. In waterlogged areas where preservation is better, textiles emerge. Wool tightly woven, rough to our touch, sometimes marked with stitches, sometimes embroidered, preserved now in a museum. not lavish tapestries. We find combs made of antler or boxwood. Their teeth are narrow designed, less for styling than for catching lice. They are not luxuries, but necessities. In them is the trace of maintenance, of dignity. In one site, a child's footprint, pressed into drying clay, of a child who lived and played and likely worked, whose name was never written, but whose mark survives. Some objects confuse us, small hollow spheres carved with care, their use unclear. Tools made from bone whose function is guessed. Ceramic pieces with symbols scratched onto their base, perhaps maker's marks. Or perhaps something older, words and images long lost. Others are deeply a key, a padlock, a door hinge. Things touched every day from these archaeologists and historians reconstruct the rhythms of life. What time people rose. But in the tools she used, where animals were housed, how floors were swept, even the placement of refuse tells us about social boundaries. One pile near the back of the house, another at the edge of the village. Some pots discarded whole, others shattered. There's an art to interpreting absence. No record of a woman's name. Archaeology gives back identity without name, action without document. It teaches us that the past is not always loud. It is often quiet, layered beneath centuries of growth, and waiting patiently too. So, as we close this segment, a soft wind passes over the grass. The footprint of a foundation is outlined in stones, and there, beneath your feet, lie 1,000 forgotten moments, not lost, only sleeping. The Lord in the manor, while the peasant rose before the sun to tend the soil. Another figure awoke beneath tapestries, wrapped in linen, one not entirely separated from the village, but elevated just enough to make the distance feel eternal. A world of stone instead of wattle, of glass instead of shuttered slits, of diet, dress, and duty, sculpted by hierarchy rather than necessity. In many ways, the manor house was the axis around which the peasant world turned, but it spun at a slower, more deliberate pace, enclosed, observed, and curated with care. The typical manor, especially by the 13th century, was a structure of mixed elegance and practicality. Its walls were built of stone or heavy timber, the roof tiled or shingled, often supported by great oak beams. There was a great hall at the center, high-ceilinged and smoky, lit by narrow windows during the day and by tallow candles at night. Here the Lord dined, deliberated, and displayed. Tapestries depicting scenes of biblical or chivalric virtue adorned the walls. A raised platform at the far end marked the Lord's table. Meals were served with formality trencher. Unlike the peasant, whose fare changed little throughout the year, the Lord enjoyed variety: roasted venison, beef stews thick with wine, ale and wine were served. And yet, even here, luxury had its limit. Meat went rancid quickly, and salt was still the guardian of freshness. Daily life in the manor followed its own ritual. The Lord rose later than his tenants, often once the first business of the estate had already begun. He might consult with his steward or bailiff those. He might sit in the manorial court. He might ride the estate, accompanied by a squire, inspecting fields, checking boundaries, or hunting in the woods beyond. The hunt was not only pastime, it falcons, greyhounds. The hunt reinforced status, and yet the Lord was not wholly idle. He bore responsibility. He was expected to maintain peace within his domain, to contribute to military service, either personally or by financing soldiers, and to fulfill the obligations of hospitality, and occasionally hosting great feasts, if the Lord travelled to another estate, or to campaign his absence was felt. But the machinery of his estate continued. His lady of the manara title, not always equal in right. She oversaw the kitchens, the accounts, the servants, and the distribution of stores. She might be literate. She might act as patron to a nearby nunnery, or fund repairs to the church roof. Her clothing was finer than the peasants'. Woolen gowns dyed in earthy reds or greens. Perhaps a belt with small pouches for combs. Both lord and lady. They could not be entirely indifferent to the village, staffed their kitchens, supplied their rents. And so they walked a line between command and dependency. They might visit the church alongside their tenants, seated in their own pew, but sharing the same Latin words. They might pardon a fine, or impose a new one. They might receive gifts at Christmas eggs, a basket of apples, and give in return a coin or a loaf. A peasant might labour a lifetime and never enter the manor house, might never speak directly to the Lord, and yet their worlds were bound not only by law and land, but by ritual and rhythm. The manor depended on the village for survival, and the village knowingly or not shaped the manor's wealth, its quiet power, its ability to endure. These two worlds coexisted in parallel, one resting in the shade of the other, one sweating beneath the sun. In the next part, we step even further into contrasting the rare moments where those worlds touched, and the quiet tension that followed. The world of the peasant. It was not that lords moved among the people frequently. Most remained within the boundaries of their manors, attending only to business that required their attention. But when their paths did cross, it could leave a quiet tremor in the fabric of villagers' life. These were not just social encounters. A peasant summoned to the manorial court, his head bowed, cap in hand, voice subdued, not from guilt. The court itself often held in the great hall, or even beneath a tree, if the weather permitted, was a form of spectacle. The lord or his steward presided. Local jurors, themselves, peasants, would bear witness. Names recorded. A pig found in another man's field, ale brewed without a license. Failure to send a son to perform required labor, a warning. In some cases, an obligation increased, gathering firewood from the wrong stretch of forest. Each was met not with outrage, but with procedure. But there were other, more delicate kinds of offence. A serf marrying outside the manor without permission, a tenant delaying payment, or even failing to bow when the lord passed on horseback. These acts, some intentional, others accidental, were handled with the same deliberate quiet as all else, and yet, behind the words spoken in the hall was the silent understanding. Sometimes that power was used kindly, a debt forgiven, a sickly tenant spared labor for a season, a widow allowed to remain on her husband's plot. Such gestures were rare, but other times the law was pressed hard. A family removed from its holding, an extra week of labor imposed as penalty, a cow seized as payment for back rent. These punishments did not spark rebellion, but they marked the limits of tolerance. There were also quieter moments. A peasant boy selected to serve in the manor kitchen, an honor of sorts, though it often meant a life of service. A daughter chosen to enter the Lord's household, either as a servant or, in some cases, as companion to the lady of the manor. These moments were laced with uncertainty. To serve the Lord was to be seen. To be seen was to be judged. And judgment, in a world without clear recourse, one might find rare joy in the proximity to wealth, but also pressure, surveillance, and above all, the Lord and his family watching from above, or mingling politely among their tenants. Even gifts between the classes held subtle meaning. A peasant who brought the Lord a bushel of apples might receive thanks or silence. The exchange was not one of equals. Even kindness could reinforce the lines. Festivals sometimes blurred the boundaries, but on feast days or harvest festivals, the village might gather before the manor for ale, bread, and meat. There might be dancing. These moments were rare, scripted by tradition, and after the last song, the world returned to its arrangement. Lords above, peasants below, privilege beside toil, power beside prayer. Still, some peasants pushed back carefully. A delay in paying rent might not be defiance. A missing bundle of firewood, a borrowed ox, returned a day late, a murmured complaint in the alehouse. Others resisted more boldly. There are records, fragmentary, but real, of peasants challenging unfair fines or appealing to a higher lord, of refusing to work an extra day, of leaving the manor without permission. These were risky acts, but they remind us that peasants were not without agency. Their voices were low. In most cases, a bowed head at a distance, a brief exchange on the road, enough to remind the peasant of his place, and perhaps enough to remind the Lord that his world, comfortable and secure, was balanced on the labor of those he rarely saw. The manor and the village were not at war. They existed in a kind of managed tension, and so the shadows passed one another, rarely equal, always aware. The architecture of separation. A single road. It might seem like a narrow distance, just a morning's walk, but in the medieval world, that short distance carried with it an entire chasm of class, of custom, and of lived experience. The peasant and the noble shared the same land. They breathed the same air, knelt in the same churches, and watched the same rain fall from the sky. And yet, they lived in entirely separate worlds, each shaped by their own physical space, by walls, by windows, by gates and thresholds that defined where one life ended and the other began. The contrast began with the buildings themselves. In the peasant village, homes were built of wattle and daub, with timber frames filled with woven branches and plastered with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes dung. Windows, if they existed, were covered with oiled cloth or wooden shutters. The roofs were thatched, no chimneys, just a hearth in the center. A typical home consisted of one room, shared by a family and The manor house, it had a hall, a sola above the lords, private quarters, sometimes a separate kitchen building. The floor was often flagged or wooden. Manor walls were thick, sometimes 2 feet of stone. The windows narrow, often glazed, especially in wealthier households. Inside, the furniture was sparse but robust, and tall, canopied beds. These physical structures weren't just shelter, no fences, just custom and memory to mark the edges. They were statements of permanence, of position, of power. The lord's house sat on a rise, or apart from the rest of the village, commanding a view. The peasant's home nestled close to others, close for warmth, for work, for survival. Even boundaries were different. Peasant land was open. Long strips worked by different families, shared meadows for grazing, commons for firewood. The lord's domain was enclosed, defined, not always by a wall but by ditch, hedge, or charter. A deer park, a garden protected from foraging livestock, an orchard planted not for necessity within the manor walls. Servants moved with routine. Clocks, though rare, were sometimes kept by monastic communities. In the village, time was not kept by chime or dial but by sunlight, labor, and the toll of the church bell, the rooster's call, a book of hours, a Latin volume, the length of the shadow. Architecture separated, not just space but. In the manor there were books, not many but enough. A psalter. In the village, books were unknown. If stories were told, they passed from mouth to ear. In the manor, clothing was dyed, lined, and stitched with fine thread. In the village, it was mended, faded, and patched. In the manor, decisions were made. In the village, even the natural world behaved differently across this boundary. The woods belonged to the lord. To cut trees, to hunt deer, to trap rabbits all required permission. Yet for the peasant, for firewood, for mushrooms. And so, the line between permission and necessity blurred. Sometimes, a peasant crossed into the lord's forest. Quietly, a fallen branch collected, a snare set. Sometimes they were caught, sometimes not. This was the quiet negotiation of the invisible boundaries that lay across the land, lines not drawn on maps, but enforced by centuries of understanding. There was awe in how the manor looked, but present. The peasant might wonder at the warm food, the servants, the carved woodwork, but he also knew that each stone in the wall, each roast on the table, each cushion in the chair had come from his labor. Still, few dreamed of rebellion, not because they lacked imagination. And so, 2 worlds stewed, one survived through sweat, both were vulnerable to plague, to famine, but one had walls thick enough to wait it out. The other had only hope. For centuries, the system of lord and peasant seemed unshakable. Like the seasons, it returned again and again, tilled, planted, the hall and the hut, both woven together like strands in the same rope. But ropes fray, and even the most ancient systems face change. In the 14th century, a breath that carried illness. The Black Death, beginning in 1348. Rich and poor alike. In some manors, entire villages were emptied. Cottages sat quiet, Ploughs rusted in the fields, churchyards filled, and suddenly the structure of society bent. Fewer peasants meant fewer hands to work the land. Landowners once secure in their power found themselves vulnerable, and the peasants who remained began to realize their value. Some negotiated, some moved from one estate to another, seeking better terms. Some refused the old obligations. In England, the Statute of Labourers was issued in 1351, but the balance had shifted. For the first time in centuries, the line between lord and peasant wavered, not disappeared, not reversed, but strained. By the late 14th century, uprisings emerged, constant. In 1381, the peasants' revolt in England led by Wat Tyler rose in response to poll taxes and continued feudal restrictions. Marching on London, they demanded the end of serfdom, fair rents, and the removal of corrupt officials. For a brief moment, the village came to the city. Nor you. And the lords looked into the eyes of those who had always bowed their heads. The revolt was suppressed. Tyler killed. Promises made by King Richard II quietly revoked. But the crack had appeared. Serfdom did not end that year, but it began to dissolve. By the 15th century, in many regions of Europe, personal bondage faded. Rents were paid in coin, not labor. Peasants began to own or lease land. New economic systems grew to Nancy wage labor markets. The manor system, once rigid, some adapted, others fell into decline, unable to maintain their estates. Without free labor, their titles intact, but their coffers empty. Still, the contrast between elite and peasant endured in other ways. Political power was largely closed to those outside nobility, but the wall had cracked. From that crack came new possibilities for mobility, for change, for lives not shaped solely by the fields of their birth. And yet, for many, little changed. Poverty remained. The rhythms of hunger, illness, and work kept their whole. The manor might fade, but inequality persisted. What truly changed was the shape of power, no longer sealed inside a single building or title, but scattered, evolving, moving toward the cities. And so the entwined fates of lord and peasant unraveled, not in bitterness, not always in revolt, but in adjustment. The village continued. The fields still grew, but the man who bent over the soil began to look up, not with defiance, not with certainty, and in the manor where ancestors once ruled, the descendants of lords found the world no longer waited for their command. The hierarchy broke, not like a shattering window, invisible at first, but then undeniably changed. How the peasant passed out of view by the time the medieval world gave way to the early modern age. The peasant, once the spine of society, had already begun to fade from the official view. Not in life. They still existed, still labored, still tilled and planted and harvested. But in memory, chronicles where they were kept, poems lingered on knights and ladies, not shepherds or thatchers. Even parish records, more meticulous in later centuries, noted births and deaths, and yet, in the stories told afterward, they became almost invisible. When they were mentioned, they were often the ideal peasant, loyal, hard-working, content with little, grateful to the landowner. Or the dangerous Mabangri, ignorant, threatening rebellion. Either way, they remained flattened, without depth. The real peasant waking with sore joints, hoping for enough barley to last. The winter was seldom allowed to appear, and so the peasant passed quietly out of the center of written history. But traces lingered in language, phrases passed down, old sayings rooted in agricultural toil, words for work, for land, for hardship, that still echo in modern tongues, in place, names, field, cat, each a sign that someone once lived there, ancient customs embedded in property rights and tenancy, still visible in land records, long after their origin was forgotten, and in stories though more fiction than fact, fairy tales and folk tales. He was Jack who climbed the beanstalk, the third son who married the princess after outwitting his richer brothers. These were dreams, not records, but they held a kind of truth. They told us that peasants were not forgotten completely. They remained as archetype, as foundation, and in some cases they were reshaped to suit the concerns of those remembering. During the Romantic period, writers and painters turned their gaze to the peasant with new fascination. The simplicity of rural life was romanticized pastoral scenes of shepherds under golden skies, of milkmaids in pristine aprons, of noble toil untroubled by hardship. But this was not the peasant. It was the idea of the peasant, crafted for comfort, for nostalgia, for contrast against the noise of industrial cities. In these versions, suffering was softened. The mud of the village lane was left out. The ache of constant labor ignored. The hunger, the cold, the endless repetition painted over in broad strokes. It was not malice. It was memory selective, curated. And yet, even these distortions remind us of something important, that the peasant's life mattered enough to be reimagined, to be called upon as a measure of how far the world had come more, perhaps what it had lost. Modern historians have tried to reverse this silence, using archaeology, manorial rolls, letters, tax records, and even the patterns of abandoned villages, not to pity, to give shape to those who endured centuries of labor, who fed nations, who raised children, who passed down songs, recipes, customs, and quiet strength. The peasant does not need to be reimagined, nor condemned as backward, as a man who rose in the dark and lit the fire, as a woman who walked barefoot to the well every morning of her life, as a child who learned to sew before learning to speak, in those acts repeated billions of times across Europe, across generations lie the foundations of modern life, not in triumph, not in transformation, but in endurance. And so, as we begin to close this journey, we begin also to listen more closely to the past that pressed no ink but left its imprint in the earth itself. In the next part, we'll look at how fiction and popular media have reinterpreted the peasantess life, and why those portrayals often matter more than they seem, how stories changed the peasant It comes from a novel, a figure in rough wool, stooped in the rain, clutching a hoe, or a comical background, muttering in an accent just unfamiliar enough to be called medieval. These portrayals are not entirely wrong, but neither are they quite right. They are filter stories passed through other stories, shaped by the concerns of the age that tells them. For centuries after the end of feudalism, the peasant appeared in fiction primarily as backdrop. His presence helped establish. His life was rarely the focus, but his world was stage scenery for knights, kings, witches, and saints. And then, slowly, he began to take center stage. In 19th century literature, especially under the influence of Romanticism and the rise of national folklore movements, peasants began to appear more fully. In Russia, authors like Nikolai Gogol and Leo Tolstoy portrayed the rural poor with deep interest, sometimes reverent, sometimes harsh, but always with attention. In England, Thomas Hardy offered pastoral scenes tinged with hardship and fate. In France, Émile Zola and George Sand presented peasants in novels that blurred sympathy with realism. These fictional peasants were not always accurate representations, but they were complex. Yet these portrayals also reflected the needs of the audience, not necessarily the truth of the past. The peasant became a symbol of authenticity, of unspoiled nature, of moral simplicity, or of stubborn ignorance, depending on the author's aim. In modern cinema, the peasant appears in a range of roles, many of them familiar. In medieval epics, he is often the background presence, the tiller of soil behind the castle, the frightened villager fleeing invaders, the comic figure who misunderstands the knight's noble quest. In comedies, especially British or French, the peasant is the fool-earthy, sometimes clever, sometimes clueless, always set apart from sophistication. In video games, especially those with medieval settings, the peasant is often a generic unit. A farmer whose purpose is to produce resources, a woodcutter, rarely given name. But even here, the presence of the peasant tells us something about the structure of imagined medieval life, that beneath the battles and banners, someone must gather the grain. A few works have broken this mold. In literature, Umberto Eco, as The Name of the Rose, features peasants and lay brothers who speak with intelligence and irony, living complex inner lives. In cinema, Varda's Vagabond, and in television series like The Pillars of the Earth and Cadfael offer moments of insight into the lives of the rural poor, even amid their melodrama. But even the most well-intentioned portrayals often struggle with balance. How to depict hardship without turning it into spectacle. How to portray simplicity without condescension. How to make visible a life that left behind so little written record. Sometimes it is in small gestures that fiction comes closest. One who mourns with subtlety, or one who chooses within their constraints. A path that reflects agency rather than mere obedience. Historical fiction walks a narrow path. It seeks to entertain, and in doing so, it often reshapes the past in ways that reveal as much about the present as the history it tries to conjure. When peasants appear in these narratives, are they moral contrast, or are they themselves full and flawed and whole. There is no perfect portrayal, but every portrayal matters. Or slowly returns. Beyond books and fiction, the medieval peasant lives on in another form, carefully rebuilt, reinterpreted in museums and outdoor history sites, in classrooms and heritage centers. The everyday life of a long-forgotten villager is brought gently and deliberately, not through imagination. These efforts often begin with a question. What did it feel like to live in a medieval village? Not as a knight, not as a priest, but as the ordinary person who turned the soil, gathered the kindling, and walked barefoot through frostbitten fields. It's not an easy question to answer. The peasant left behind few possessions, so historians, archaeologists, from these whole worlds are pieced together and then reconstructed. Consider the open-air museums of Europe, quiet acres of land where peasant homes have been recreated not as grand exhibits, clay daub, mixed and applied, wood smoke rising from a working hearth. In England, sometimes using timber from medieval forests. In France, castle is constructed using only 13th century methods, each stone laid by hand, each rope and pulley based on medieval engineering, though the focus may be on architecture. In Germany and Scandinavia, similar efforts blend scholarship. Weavers use blacksmiths heat iron, children learn to card wool, knead dark rye bread, milk goats. These recreations are not fantasy, they are acts of remembrance. But even within these efforts, there is a delicate balance. How to represent hardship, how to offer authenticity without erasing the complexity of past lives. Too often, the past is polished for comfort, the floor swept to clean, the labor shown as charming rather than grueling. Yet, when done with care, these reconstructions become not just informative but reflective. Visitors walk into a cottage and feel the low ceiling, the dim light. They feel the absence of privacy, the press of shared space, and perhaps, for a moment, they understand something deeper than any textbook could offer. Educational materials have also evolved. In classrooms, what they ate, how they celebrated what it meant to be tired, to be hungry, to be devout, to be poor always. Documentaries walk the line between past and present. They recreate a day in the life, a year on the land. Historians cook peasant stews over open flames. They plant barley in furrowed fields. They wear the rough woolen tunic, feel it itch at the neck, and speak softly about what that tells us. Even virtual reconstructions have a place. Digital villages, to peer inside homes, to hear, with layered sound design, the bleating of goats, the splash of water, the distant toll of the church bell. These efforts do not resurrect. They do not bring back a vanished world, but they illuminate. And through that illumination, they remind us that history is not made only by generals or monarchs. It is built quietly. In museums, a child may run their hand over the wood of a reconstructed stool. A teacher may watch their class knead dark bread and speak of hunger. A visitor may step across a threshold made of stone, and for a moment, the distance shrinks. The past and the peasant, once forgotten, stands again, and now the last embers in the hearth have cooled. The tools are hung by the door, the wall has been spun, and the one before it has long since faded from view. But their memory endures not in monuments or epic tallies, but in the lines of our countryside, in the ruins of churches built by villagers who carved the stone and carried it, day after day, from the quarry to the hill. In the dishes we still make porridge, bread, stews, echoes of survival recipes, refined, and in the languages we speak, filled with the words of tools and seasons and labor. The legacy of the peasant is not a grand legacy. It is a humble one, a slow accumulation of effort, a pattern repeated across generations until it became simply the rhythm of life. We live now in a world largely removed from that rhythm. Electricity hums where once candlelight flickered. Clocks govern our days instead of the rising sun. The chill of winter is held at bay, but in quieter moments, perhaps in the garden or walking a worn country lane, we might feel a shadow of their world. The patience of a season, the weight of a day's work, the meaning of warmth. They left behind so few words, so few names, so few legacies. It is the story of those who endured. The woman who tended her sick child with herbs grown in a corner patch. The old man who taught a boy to mend his boots. The child who learned, before he could write, how to read the sky. These are not grand acts. They are not remembered with fanfare, but they are, in the truest sense, human. And so we come to the end of this journey. From dawn in the cottage to the fading echoes of the manor's rule, from fragments beneath the soil, we have walked slowly, gently, through the peasant's day, the peasant's world, and the peasant's memory. And now, perhaps, as you lie here in the stillness, you carry with you just a little of their story, not in sorrow, not in judgment, because what they sought at the end of each long, laborious day was not so different from what we seek now. A place to rest, a roof to shelter, a warmth to hold, and sleep soft and deep. Like a field turned after harvest, let your breath slow, let your thoughts drift. Like wood smoke from a chimney, let your mind, the stars overhead, remain. The soil turned by 1,000 forgotten hands, and you tethered to their legacy. Good night.